Hey, well, welcome to the downtown stage to listen to Jonathan Lethem discuss his new book, his upcoming novel, Dissident
Thank you.
Gardens.
Thank you.
First of all, it's great to have you here.
Yeah.
It's interesting that this is the downtown stage. Is that the downtown in terms of the building, do you think? Or
Yeah, I think we're in the downtown of this building.
Yes.
Can everyone hear us okay? It's with the reverb from the audience, it's tricky, but
yes, there's a lot of murmuring.
I have to believe.
We have to be over the level of murmuring. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you,
Okay.
Chuck, for doing this.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure. First thing I wanted to ask you, this actually might seem like a almost purposefully confusing question, but I'm wondering, do you consider this novel a political novel, or is it just a novel that's about politics? In other words, this novel basically is over the expanse of time in New York, basically kind of follows the lives of like pretty staunch leftists, kind of radicals over time. And I'm curious if you feel as though you are just sort of describing how that experience would inform someone's life, or if you see this as, at least compared to your other books, more overtly political and that you are forwarding an idea.
Okay, well, I'll start saying I think that art is helplessly political. I mean, I think that all my books are political.
You do, all of them.
Because that's sort of what happens. When you make art, it occupies some sort of implicit political space. It either shores up the status quo and people's assumptions, or it interrogates them. At some level, it just can't help doing that. So I think that, I've always said when the question came up that I thought, yeah, my work was sort of political. But I know that it's a very deeply sublimated politics. And of course, almost everyone who writes fiction would scramble probably to say, oh, well, I guess if they were forced to accept my premise that all art is political, they would say, well, I'm not conscious of that, I don't control that, I don't try to make it political, and I don't know where you would identify the obvious political, stuff in it. And I think that's true of a lot of my stuff, that it's very, very deeply sublimated. This book, to me, isn't any more political than anything I've written before, but what it is about people who are living lives that are expressly, consciously political lives. So it's about the effect of believing yourself, being proudly political, the effect that has on your experience of life.
Well, that's interesting. So you say, like a book like Motherless Brooklyn, what do you feel is the political extension? I'm not disagreeing with you, but when you say it's so sublimated, when you look over at your past work, what do you, like, is it because you discuss economics? Is it because you're discussing...
No, I mean, I guess for me, it's a belief that politics is something that's invested in our experience in a very intrinsic way. And so, I mean, Motherless Brooklyn, in some ways, it's a dry run for The Fortress of Solitude. It seems to me the race stuff is the political stuff in that book that you could really tease out. But when I say that all art is political, I mean something even more kind of, holistic than that. That the way the characters live in society is, it doesn't come from nowhere. It sort of comes from assumptions and traditions, and people's stakes, class issues, race issues are sort of there everywhere. You just can't help handling them. And I think novels just do it all the time. They do it sort of automatically.
I mean, what's interesting, though, is if somebody was, this is kind of almost a perception type thing, but if somebody read Chronic City and wanted to talk about it, they would bring up, like the big cats and the subway and stuff. But now when people talk about this book, I would guess that when it starts being reviewed, that the politics are going to immediately push to the forefront.
It'll be
so
how
and do you feel? I'm sure you're not uncomfortable with that, but are you interested to see how you as an artist are now analyzed as sort of a political thinker?
Well, I don't think that anyone's going to make a very coherent analysis of the political stance of this book, because I didn't put one in. So it won't be very easy to do in a way anyway that would persuade me. But let me back up, because you mentioned Chronic City, and say, well, let me back up even further. When I first started writing, one of the things that I mean, I couldn't have articulated any of this at the time, but one of the things that I knew that I wanted to do after I'd written 3 or 4 books was put very real, very tangible life, like just the day-to-day, mundane experience of people slogging through reality, trying to get along, this sort of mimetic, dogged, I can rap on this tabletop and it's real kind of stuff. I wanted to put it together with what, in a way, I guess the first name I had for it was the fantastic. I wanted to put strangeness into reality and just make sure that they were both really present at the same time and talking to each other. And for that reason, I was sort of writing science fiction or fantasy early on. And when I wrote Motherless Brooklyn, some people who were accustoming themselves to what I'd done before were really confused that the book didn't have anything fantastical in it.
But a kid takes off and
Well,
flies.
I think it's the language. I think Tourette's and the language is
Oh, no, you're talking Motherless Brooklyn, you're saying.
Motherless Brooklyn.
Yes, Brooklyn
is Motherless Brooklyn.
Yeah.
The language is the fantastic element. Tourette's syndrome is sort of, it's like a neurological dream life, right? And so it still was, for me, very much consonant with how I like to just put the life we can all, confirm with our senses, the daily prosaic reality, together with something that's distorting it, like a field or a dream or some sort of impulse or fantasy that just warps that experience of reality. And for me, Tourette syndrome was one of those things. Well, obviously, as you point out, the magic ring in Fortress of Solitude was another one. I think, in a way, ideology or communism, the idea of world revolution in the 20th century is the fantastic element in Dissident Gardens. It's the thing that is taking all the people who are living their daily lives, slogging through, getting on the subway in Queens and, working in a pickle factory, but at the same time, they're living in this dream life that the world is about to change. And it's about to change because of something that they believe that's intangible, that can't be contained or explained or defended on prosaic terms, and that's revolution, So it's really very much of a piece with what I always find myself doing, which is writing about how lives are distorted by some kind of dream life or other thing that's not confirmable by the senses.
Okay, now your mom was a political activist,
Yeah.
correct? Okay,
Yeah.
so now here, I guess, is my question. Maybe the answer will be neither, but would you say that your parents had socialist leanings, or were they communists? And if so, how does that change your interpretation of those terms, particularly since so many people who will read this book, the average American basically is raised, particularly if they grew up in the 70s and 80s, has a very different view of communism. So I'm curious, how would you describe what your parents really were, and how did that inform how you understand that ideology?
Well, I didn't understand it. And I mean, in a way, I don't know that...
But you didn't understand it?
I didn't understand it at the time. That's a really important thing to say. I absorbed it without understanding it. But, I mean, to speak really specifically, the generation of activists that my parents were both part of, protesters, it was a very characteristic New Left, 60s era activism, which was one that had a very strange relationship to the idea of communism, because in most quarters, and my parents really weren't outside of this very general experience, communism as such, Marxism, the Soviet Union, was discredited in the middle 50s. It was hounded. American communism was hounded by McCarthyism, but it was also if you'd been a Stalinist, if you'd believed even passingly in the dream of the Soviet Union as the emblem of this ideal, well, you'd been humiliated by the Khrushchev revelations, right? What came out just made it really untenable, really impossible to go on defending this choice you'd made. So the New Left, and my parents were absolutely typical in this way, had a really strange, there was a silence, there was a black hole, there was a mystery around the idea of traditional communism as it was known up to that point. And so it was really my grandmother's generation that could have been an American communist. My parents could never have really identified that way.
Did they perceive communism as a realistic thing that could happen in their lifetime? Or was it more like, this is what we feel about the world, it certainly can't happen in America because it seemed absolutely impossible?
I don't think that anyone was thinking about, I mean, short of like the weathermen, you know, the kind of almost nihilistic vanguard. And my parents were absolutely not in that space. You know, and that still seems very exotic to me. I mean, when I read about it, or you know, see it depicted in a book like Philip Roth's, you know, American Pastoral, I'm like, I know I wasn't experiencing that. Instead, what I grew up inside was the peace movement, you know, vigils against the death penalty.
So they would have perceived the weathermen. They wouldn't have said like, well, I guess they're just the radical fringe of what we're doing. They would have found that problematic?
Well, I think that they were nonviolent. They were passionately nonviolent. My father specifically became a Quaker in the middle of my childhood because it was a spiritual practice that was consonant with his pacifism. And so my mother was a little more of a yippie in some ways. She had a kind of an impulse to, you know, we didn't just boycott grapes and lettuce. She would go to the supermarket and move some extra portions of grapes and lettuce into the freezer so they'd be ruined. So she had a little bit of a kind of yippie-ish prankster impulse, but that's not being a weatherman. It's being
that's a very low impact weatherman.
Yeah, very low impact.
Grapes.
And I put that into the book because it seemed to me very striking because it's the sort of behavior that now, I guess the current equivalent would be to you know, be a member of Anonymous or something.
Yeah.
But that's still not being a weatherman, you know?
Another thing that's interesting is that your mother passed away. It's kind of personal, I guess. Your mother passed away when you were 13, okay?
Yeah.
And you've talked about how there's always, as totally understandable, almost this hole both in yourself and in your writing. But this book, which I assumed then would have been dedicated to your mother, is actually dedicated to your father at 80. What does that mean? Why did you make that decision? Why isn't this the book that's dedicated? Because then I think that a pop psychologist would say if someone is dealing with the loss of their mother their whole life, they might write a book or create a piece of art that basically focuses on the kind of ideology that she embodied.
Well, I mean, the very specific part of your question, it's never occurred to me to dedicate a book to a person who isn't alive, because it seems like a gift, a specific transaction, a dedication, and so it would be thrown to the winds to trouble over putting a dedication. I don't know, maybe sometime I'll have that impulse in a way that will suddenly make sense to me. But every time I've dedicated a book, it's been to someone living who could know and care that it had happened. But my father is this enormous force in my life and of continuity and knowledge, and he, you know, he's really the person through whom all of this knowledge and contemplation flows for me about the past. And this is the book I've written that, I mean, even far more than Fortress of Solitude, really draws on my own marveling at, you know, where did I come from? What was the world like just before I was in it? And I needed the testimony of a lot of people who were 80 years old, not just my father, but I spent a lot of time with friends. I was fortunate in having certain key sources. You know, I talked with Vivian Gornick quite a bit, who grew up as a kind of a, you know, red diaper baby of approximately my mother's generation. Vivian's a little bit older than my mother would have been if my mother was still alive. But I needed to kind of move backwards in time to write this book. And so people who were like my father remembered the 50s with their own physical bodies, with their five senses. They were, you know, they galvanized my sense that this project was worth writing, you know, was worth doing, and that I could do it by talking with me about it.
I kind of want to ask you about some stuff that's outside of this novel, I guess, things that I'm just curious about.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm particularly curious about in your essay collection, which is almost a memoir, like The Ecstasy of Influence, you talk about sort of, you hitchhike across the country, you end up in San Francisco, and then I think there's like a 12-year gap before your book comes out. Right,
Yeah,
your first novel?
That's about right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm really curious about those 12 years.
Yeah.
Like during that period, were you of the mindset that's like, hey, I'm going to be a writer, it just takes time, I'm just getting better at this? Were you similar to the person you are now, but just not tangibly accomplished? How did your friends perceive you during that period? Because not like you won genius grants and stuff. It's like a concession that you're a genius almost. You know? So what was it like then, before any of this had been proven?
Of course, I don't know how my friends perceive me. By definition, that's sort of another mystery that I could guess at, and I could. But I worked in a bookstore all that time, and I was writing all that time, and the people who knew me well, I think, thought I was just really weirdly a grind. I was just really obsessed with what I was trying to do, and part of that was I was living in the Bay Area, which is not as much, if you come to New York in your 20s, this was my 20s, and you declare that you're going to be a writer, you're kind of in the teeth of aspiration. Everyone around you is either trying their own thing, maybe trying the exact same thing, or trying to work up the ladder in the publishing industry, or and there's this intense, anxious sense that some people around you are going to definitely do this, and some people around you are going to fail, and I know this atmosphere because I've taught in the grad programs at both NYU and Columbia, in the MFA programs.
And you see a difference in the students themselves?
Oh yeah, I mean the whole atmosphere of the city though is what I'm thinking about. But I was enacting my apprenticeship in the Bay Area, which is a very different space. It's a place where a lot of people go to develop their life more on lifestyle terms, less in terms of aspiration. So I was just like weirdly driven. I think a lot of people looked at me, and if they had any belief that I was right about what I was doing, they were impressed. But if they didn't, and that might only be that they had no basis to judge, because I wasn't showing them the pages, or that they just didn't have any reason to believe that it was really going to come true. They just probably saw me as some sort of cartoon character, like, oh, that bookstore guy who like runs home and writes a chapter.
So are there just tons and tons of unpublished pages from this period that you were just, or did a lot of that end up becoming these books?
No, I wrote a novel that will never be published. Yeah. I mean, I began that book actually, the true first novel, I began before I even left for the West Coast, when I was still in the sort of the middle of dropping out at Bennington, but I hadn't quite had the courage to do it. I started a novel there, and it took me 4 years to finish it and figure out that it wasn't any good. And the thing I began next was what eventually was published as my first novel. But there's also probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 short stories from that period. But that's not an immense amount of, I don't know what your experience is, but that's not that large a body of unpublished work. I mean, I know people who wrote 4 or 5 novels before they wrote one that they were able to publish, or really that they wanted to even try.
Well, that kind of leads into what I wanted to ask you next. I mean, there are many things I admire about you, but I think one of the, it's not just the writing that you do and your ability as a writer, it is the degree to which you are prolific. I just find that really amazing. And I'm kind of curious as to how important you view being prolific to not just a writer, but any artist. I mean, I know that you're essentially now probably like the foremost Philip K. Dick scholar in America. So that now he's the one end of this continuum, right? He's the most prolific person.
Yeah.
Now on the other end, you have people, I guess, like Truman Capote and some of these people who wrote very little. I think that their sort of cultural memory seems vaguely similar, even though one put out a ton of work and one put out. So how do you gauge this? How important is the amount you create in accordance with what the content actually is?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is, by the standard that I sort of absorbed as a reader, the kinds of writers that happened to be particularly most important to me when I was young, a lot of them were prolific in a way that makes my result look very ordinary. I mean, not just Philip K. Dick, but
L. Ron Hubbard.
L. Ron Hubbard, yeah. No, but Graham Greene, or Iris Murdoch, or Patricia Highsmith. I mean, these are people who, when they wound it up, there were 40 novels, 30 or 40 novels on a shelf, and I'm not on that pace. This is my 9th novel to be published, and I'm turning 50 next year. So I'm actually, I'm simultaneously, I'm really gratified when people say that I'm prolific.
Well, but you have 9 novels, but you also have a whole bunch of nonfiction work.
I do have a
and
bunch
then
of
magazine
nonfiction
work
books.
Occasionally. And
Yeah, not that.
And didn't
not
you
that
do
much.
a comic book as well, or is
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
I like to keep working. I mean, I really love to work, and I don't find torment in the experience of writing. I've always thought it was really hard, but really exciting way for me to spend time. I mean, the experience of writing my novels is a part of my life that I really treasure. I don't think, oh God, I'm so glad that's over, and the result is something I'm proud of. I think I miss the days spent writing Dissident Gardens. I'm currently like mourning that experience because it was a great one, and so I'm eager to be in that frame, that attitude, that situation again, where I'm discovering a book. I just love to do it, and I do think that most of the writers that matter the most to me, if you really look at their life story, even someone like Kafka, well, he wrote a lot of words. If you look at those books of letters and you look at how brief his life was, and he was writing all the time. It was a consuming practice for him, right? And again, I'm not that prolific on the scale of someone like Dickens. If you look at word counts, or in the scale of someone like Graham Greene, I just think it's a more traditional thing in a way. It comes out of my identifying with writers who were always writing. It just seems like that's what it is to be a writer to me.
Do you think, though, that the meaning of this is different in different idioms? Like, we've talked about music a lot, okay?
Yeah.
In this regard, in music, there's
Yeah.
people like Guided by Voices and Ryan Adams and stuff,
Right.
putting out music all the time, okay? Well, if you
Yeah.
intend to put out 50 or 60 records, one has to assume there's going to be peaks and valleys.
Yeah.
So is it different with writing because it is a more sort of cerebral, controlled process, so that everyone should essentially is as prolific as they can be?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I really care enormously about revision and getting it right. And I'm still thinking about sentences or sequences in Dissident Gardens that I only just finally resolved at the last minute. In a couple of cases, even just after that galley that you guys will read, in the last pass I had at the pages, I was still worrying over things. So it's not about like this sort of first thought, best thought, just blurting it all out, but more about a sense of engagement, that I just want to always be engaged with my own practice. It seems to me that it grows the more I'm centered in it, and that's what I'm doing it for, is to be, to maximize whatever gifts I happen to have been lucky enough to have through, I don't even want to call it rigor, because it's sort of, anytime you use a word like rigor, it suggests someone else isn't working hard enough, like you're praising yourself for working diligently when other people don't. But I just mean like abiding with it, presence, just being with my own art, because it matters to me and it feels good. It feels really important.
Well, I mean, this is partially, it's like your answer will be, I suppose, a little bit dependent on technology, but the process of writing a novel, do you do multiple full-on drafts, or do you have one draft that you continually work through? Because now, during the age of typewriters, I can understand that process.
Yeah.
But now it seems like no one does that, and I'm curious what your position is.
Yeah, I think about this all the time, because I teach writing, and my students will ask me about, they'll call something their third draft, and a part of me just wants to say to them, you have no idea what you're even talking about. You don't have drafts. I wrote 3 novels on manual typewriters.
Oh, you did?
And then
on actual
yeah, absolutely.
Why?
Because the first writer I knew growing up, a guy named L.J. Davis, used a manual typewriter, and to him that was like, it was a craft issue. For him, it was you needed to have strong fingers, and you didn't want to have a dependency on electricity, and you wanted to change ribbons. And I also think, in a funny way, I was very I connected it to my training. You know, I grew up in the home of a painter. My dad made drawings and paintings, and I did it for a long time. And I think I felt in a way like I was carving those novels. You know, like when you're using the...
So it was symbolic almost
It was about a physical urgent. It was like using these little metal things to strike against this inky other thing, and, you know, putting it on the page, and you could feel the ripples from on the back of the page. You could feel the strikes of the letters. And anytime I wanted to draft something, I had to roll a fresh sheet of paper in and do it all over again. Or I did use a lot of whiteout, which is another thing that's like being a painter. It's like, that word isn't right. I'm going to paint over it white, blow on it, let it dry in the cool air, and then I'm going to put another stronger strike over it that'll be even better. So I was really attached to this physical practice, and drafts were manual labor. I would retype the entire book. So I would learn about, you know, what happens if you do that is you commit to every sentence again with your body. Even the ones you think were good, you retype them and you think it feels right or it doesn't feel right. And I tell my students, you want to try this. Maybe not on a manual typewriter, but try at least print out your story, delete your file. I mean, really, put it in the trash and empty the trash so it doesn't exist anymore, and then open up a new document and retype your whole story so that you'll know your fingers and your eyes will have to go through committing to those sentences, because that's how I learned to write.
Do you ever write longhand?
No,
never.
My handwriting is very cramped and uncomfortable. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't be able to go very long.
I mean, I guess the other logical question is, what stopped you from, why you said for 3 novels you did this and then you quit. Did you feel like I've trained myself to do this?
I think in many ways I did learn what I needed to so that I could trust the computer. By the time I was introduced to that tool, I could say, I know I'm going to go, you know, to the lengths. I need to go with this paragraph or this sentence, even in this new amorphous. You know, I mean, the computer isn't always easier. It's also possible to get really lost in the kind of polymorphous quality. You know, draft just flows and you don't know where the boundaries are. And I don't know that that's always helpful, but it is seductive, right? It's certainly seductive. I think I do trust that I know what I need to know, but I still print out and work. I hand correct pages and I open new files and retype things. When I need to figure things out, I'll use my own draft method. I'll go back to it.
You know, obviously there are many qualities that go into being a writer, doing fiction or nonfiction. I'm curious, if you could amplify one of these 2 characteristics about yourself and increase it, which would you choose? Would you prefer to amplify and increase your ability to think critically? Or would you apply to amplify and increase your ability to tap into your own emotion? Like, if you could make yourself a more, I don't know, either more intellectually aggressive in that way or more emotionally sort of solvent, what would you?
As a novelist, the emotional connectivity is the much more important avenue, and I would certainly pick the latter.
And why is it so much more important? Because it makes sense that you would say that, but I'm curious how you would describe why.
Well, I mean, I think it was the journey I had to make anyway. In a way, I mean, I don't want to suggest that my early writing is very intellectually advanced, but almost anyone can stop and think hard enough to do the kind of thinking that a novelist does. You know, I mean, not everyone chooses to.
Well, what does that mean? So you're saying that any person could imagine a story in their mind that has plot mechanics and
Well, in
ideas?
this case, I'm not really thinking about imagination, but you suggested this idea of kind of critical faculties, critical acuity. And I think it is an important ingredient in writing anything, including writing a novel, to be able to sort of think a second time, to look at something that's a received notion or consensual reality, things that are taken for granted, and say, wait a minute, why? And could it be different? That is such an important intellectual choice. But I think it's a choice that nearly anyone could make. But to really connect to your own emotional wellsprings through language, which is itself innately intellectualized, critical, it's already so cognitive, so top-heavy with thinking, because it's language. It is itself language. So to make that cognitive stuff touch the intangible, creepy, uncertain, sad, strange life of your senses and your body and your emotions, which is really, that's the hard work. That's the challenging work. And the thing that anyone, I think, who wanted to write a novel has to push themselves and wait and search and explore in order to get nearer to. Certainly, my novels have gotten steadily, in my view, steadily more connected to my emotions.
Well, I mean, this might be an impossible question. Maybe you'll have a clear answer. How does one push themselves to be closer to their own emotions? Like, is it something that just happens with maturation, or can you consciously say, like, I'm trying to figure out why I feel?
Well, I think that push is a bad word for it, because you wouldn't tend to want to push anyone else, nor really yourself, into these spaces. It's more the verbs I would suggest. Again, I would suggest abiding, and it's mostly a path through fear, Chuck. I think that to get to those things, it's mostly, so in that sense, it's a part of it. It's associated with maturation, just in that things that used to freak you out, that you used to just stop short of, you start to realize you can be with, you can dwell closer to them. So all of those things, even some very joyful emotional things for me, have mostly been arrived at by letting go of blocks or fear. But you don't want to push someone past blocks.
And does that happen while you are typing, or does that happen while you are preparing to write? I mean, both, I'm sure, to some degree. But I'm wondering, like, is it almost something that is intrinsically related to your process as a writer, or is it something like, well, I need to get in the mindset in order to later do this thing that I want to do?
That's a great question. I think that usually it's accomplished everywhere except at the moment of typing, but sometimes quite literally right up to that instant. So it's accomplished when I'm very far from work, when I'm surprising myself in another part of my life. I'm with people, someone who matters to me, or I'm alone, or I'm dreaming or having a experience of someone else's art, listening to a song or reading someone else's novel or whatever it might be, and I sneak up on myself. And then again, it's accomplished when I'm dreaming of what book I might write and how much it might mean to me. I'm in that place where I'm sort of just reaching with or yearning for what I might do that I've never been able to do before. And then sometimes it's quite literally, as I approach, I think writing this chapter or writing this scene is going to take something I don't know that I have. And so I'll be thinking and feeling my way to it right up to that moment. But once I'm writing, and this is the beauty and this is the mystery for me of why that process is so ultimately so pleasurable, even though it involves difficulty, is that I go into a flow state where the preparations melt into an unconscious or a semi-conscious fascination. I'm like, look at that, wow, oh, hey, and I'm just sort of responding to what language is doing on the page without a tremendous amount of affective weight. I'm not thinking, oh no, I can't do this, or oh my God, I'm so great, I did this. I'm just sort of like marveling at what might occur there. So the preparations are done everywhere except at that moment.
Well, as of late, your novels have gotten bigger. They're big commitments, So you must have constant ideas of things that could be books, that could be novels. Yeah. How do you select, okay, this is the one I'm going to emotionally commit to and invest in? I mean, do you have ideas for books that you just know you'll never write, but you wish you could?
This is driving me crazy right now, because I am older, and I see limitations on my resources or my resourcefulness. I have a family life, and I'm turning 50, and physical energies change, and I do see certain books that I might have written or someone might have written that I really wish I could believe I was still going to.
Like an example would be?
I don't think I want to try to talk them out. In a way, they're too precious to me and too strange for me to put any simple names.
And I suppose you still might do that.
And maybe I still will. But I'm very conscious of this right now because this summer is going to be spent reading and recuperating and thinking about, well, specifically, it is specific, I may as well confess, 3 different possible novels that I will do next. And they all are, right now, really alive to me in this sort of twilight way. And it's sort of tragic because I know I'm going to pick one and the other 2 will wither. And I don't know whether by the time I finish the one I pick, whether those other 2 will even exist as feelings in me anymore. They will just have been chosen against.
So are you essentially daydreaming 3 novels?
Yeah, I'm daydreaming
that
3 novels right now.
That when if you're driving or sitting around, you're laying in bed, you're kind of running through these 3 possibilities.
That describes it exactly. And I think I'm cherishing that all 3 are alive in the daydreaming state, and I'm stalling because I don't want to kill 2 and pick one. It's too soon for me to let it happen.
You mentioned you were turning 50. Does that mean much to you?
Well, I've not tended to be a big birthday person, but it's an arresting number, right? It's one that almost anyone's got to pay some attention to, and
because it indicates that you're definitely in the middle of life. There's no way around it.
I hope it's the middle.
Yeah.
And I'm also looking at years in a different way because of the children. My 6-year-old just turned 6, and it's funny. I'm back in New York. I've been living in California, and I'm spending more time on this visit than I haven't in a while. And I think I'm seeing Brooklyn yet again differently, because part of your life as a parent is you see through the eyes of this other person. And I think 6 is about the age I first came to consciousness, and it's exactly the year that I remember. I mean, I can remember news events and stuff, so I can kind of confirm that I was grasping the flow of time a little bit at age 6, and it was in
that year. That was what year? 19.
That's 1970.
The news events you're remembering in your mind, the fragments.
Well, for instance, I know the Mets were trying to follow up having won the World Series, which I tragically don't remember them winning.
But you remember them that having happened.
I knew that they were the world champions, and then were in 3rd place in 1970. And I knew that we had just landed on the moon, but that I kind of couldn't honestly grasp memory. I didn't really have a memory of the day it happened.
Well, and it's strange because I'm sure that was in the news. It almost feels like you do remember.
It's funny. It's like I'm talking about everything is posthumous already by 1970. The good stuff had just been eclipsed. So anyway, so I think I'm looking at the city. I'm looking at Brooklyn through the eyes of my 6-year-old a little bit, and being restored to that part of my life. But I don't know if I'm answering this question or.
Oh no, I'm just interested.
Yeah.
I mean, this is also kind of a strange question, but I did a similar one of these with one of your friends, Matthew Spector, about a month ago. He has a book out called American Dream Machine.
Yeah.
And there's a character
novel
in this great book that is clearly based on you.
I know.
So now
I've never
curious,
had that happen before.
Yes. How did it feel to read that? Did he forewarn you? So, or did you, or he's like, maybe we'll see if he sees this, or figure it.
Yeah, no, I would never dream of controlling it or wanting to stop it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't peculiar.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
For me to experience, and in this case, I was given, not veto power, but I was made privy to it. I was shown an earlier draft of it, and. I even made a couple of suggestions, sort of given that it was so based on me. I said, what if this were true, or what if you emphasized something else here? And that just speaks to the very specific quality of my friendship with Matthew, which is we are draft exchanging friends, and I don't have that many novelists with whom I do that, so it's really intimate. So this became this doubly interesting.
Well, and it's a complicated thing because, like in the Ecstasy of Influence, you talk about your time in college, so of course you're talking about like Bret Easton Ellis and stuff. And you're writing about that in a non-fiction context.
Yeah, directly.
How does it feel differently when it's a fictional context where the person isn't you exactly, but in some ways it's almost a hyper-real version of you because it's amplifying or exaggerating at whatever he perceives most present about who you are.
Yeah. I wish I had a great answer to it. I think I would need more examples of the experience to be able to conjugate it. You know, it's still sort of very anomalous. So you know, what I do know is that I feel that it's totally open game, that I use parts of people's lives in creating characters.
Yeah, like Perkins Tooth, for example. That was either fundamentally one character or a combination of five, depending on how you look at it.
For me, it's always combinations, and that's how I not only justify it to myself, which is helpful, but I think actually that's how I make it really come to life. For me as a writer, if I were trying to sort of smuggle one real person in directly and the relationship were one-to-one, I wouldn't feel that it would be animated or electrified on the page in the way that when I take disparate parts of different people and also sometimes add in things that are just pure fantasies or inventions of my own, or sometimes I'll take a real person and I'll smash them together with someone else's fictional character in a way. And that's how I'll arrive at this, you know, then I end up with something that's perplexing enough to me that it really stands up on the page. It really exhibits a kind of behavior and momentum that becomes interesting to me. If I wanted to write about a single specific person, I would stick to doing what I did with Bret Ellis in that essay. I would actually write about them.
Okay. The last thing I'm going to ask before I take questions from the audience, I happened to tweet that I was doing this, and interestingly, 3 people all had the exact same question. There seems to be still a ton of curiosity about why Motherless Brooklyn did not become a film.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure that this is something you don't really relish discussing, but I am curious too, because I had heard that Edward Norton had purchased it. He wanted to be the main character. Then I heard that he felt he had aged out of that character. It's interesting that none of your books have had this happen yet, but what specifically happened with that?
Well, I don't have like a deep inside view of what, especially in more recent years. At the very beginning, that project was it was like one of those moments when someone announces that they're going to make a movie, and it seems so natural and alive to everyone that it really, the word of it circulates very rapidly, and it seems like almost a done deal. Well, of course, in Hollywood, there is nothing that is ever easy and nothing that is ever really a done deal.
Yeah, I mean, it was almost similar to like what happened with Gone Girl, sort of, where it was almost, it felt like this book had come out and someone had purchased it, and it was definitely happening.
Right.
But, you know.
It was spoken of that way by the production company and by Edward Norton over and over again, and he refers to it still in interviews as like a live project, but in the early years, he kept saying it was the next thing he was going to do. So people, I think, projected very understandably this sense that it must have a screenplay and it must have a whole team of producers attached and be very ready to go. It actually never was in that state. I've never seen a screenplay. It never got far enough along that it was even close.
Were you discussed as the possible screenwriter?
No, I didn't want to be involved, and I didn't happen to be invited that time. I've been invited on other occasions, and I always think that's sort of a bad path for me. So in a way, I think I'm preserving my fondness for film. For that whole world, I like to go to the movies too much to want to sort of be inside that, you know, the distressing part of that experience.
I mean, it is a strange thing where it's like, I'm sure initially it's exciting, then there's a moment of tension. How will this be? Like, are you disappointed that this hasn't happened, or to a degree relieved?
I was for a long time. And now that itself is a long time ago, and I don't really think about it on those terms. It's become fascinating to me how many different, I mean, in the alternate reality where every one of my books was, because I've had a lot of options, and in some cases a lot of screenplays written, and very interesting people involved. And in you know, Earth X, where they made them all, I would have like a David Cronenberg movie, I would have a David Lynch movie.
What book did David Lynch want to make?
Amnesia Moon. Not with himself necessarily as director. He was executive producing it and talking with other directors, but and there might be the Edward Norton Motherless Brooklyn and some other really cool stuff. I once was approached by it still seems so fascinating to me, the French director Leos Carax, who recently made Holy Motors.
Yes.
Wanted to do Girl in Landscape, but he wanted to set it in the Palestinian territories as Israelis and Palestinians instead of on Mars, which is actually brings us full circle to the fact that book has a politics, right? So he spotted the politics in that book. And so all of these, unmade films float around in my brain in an interesting way. But the crucial thing for me is that I never gave away any of my own creative energy or time to them. So I can just wonder about them, but I don't have to feel betrayed or that my time was wasted. I think we should take questions,
yes, absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll try to repeat the question whenever I hear them.
Anything.
Yeah.
I think we're going to depend on you probably coming up and telling us. It's so hard to hear. Oh, there you go. Look.
Oh.
Hi, thank you. For young authors who want to break into their first publishing gig, what advice can you offer them?
Well, I mean, my personal advice is out of date. So the first thing I always want to say is I could tell you all about what I did, and it would involve a lot of, just as my manuscripts involved a lot of whiteout and typewriter ribbons, my process of becoming an author involved a lot of self-addressed stamped envelopes and licking stamps and looking up agents' names in a physical directory. I can't even remember what it was called.
The writers, there was that big book,
yeah.
The Writer's Market, I think.
The Writer's Market, yeah. And I blundered my way in through relentless, over the transom effort. I just sent my stories to magazines constantly. I remember I had this file, it was a very well organized card file. And there was one point where I had like 15 stories out on submission. And anytime one came back, I would pride myself on putting it inside another envelope that very day and sending it out. So it was like the game was, you can't reject me faster than I can submit, I went through 3 or 4 close calls with agents with my first novel manuscript, which, as I just explained, was actually the second novel I'd written. And that took up like 3 or 4 years of almost being represented by someone. And of course, at the time, it was agony. It felt like it took forever. Now those years don't seem like anything more than a blip. And in fact, what I was doing with that time, and here's the first advice I have, is no matter what's going on with submissions or people considering things, just keep writing. Because by the time my first novel finally had an agent to represent it, I had 2 more novels finished. And I remember when I really got that great call from the guy who did become my agent, who was marvelous, I sort of had to almost break it to him. I was like, well, I'm glad you like it. I have 2 more that are ready. Is that okay? And it put me in the position to appear to be very prolific at the outset. I looked like I was writing a novel a year at the beginning of my writing life. Don't be shy of congregating with other aspiring writers. It's very ordinary, I did it too, to want to tug on the sleeve of some famous established person. But what you'll get is someone like me who all of their advice and all of their savvy is 30 years out of date. But it was really also important to me, although I didn't really value it as much as I should have at the time, to be talking with other people who were trying to do the exact same thing I was doing and were in that same environment and marketplace essentially at the same time I was, and compare notes with them and take solidarity, take heart from what they were going through, and that was really important. Collegiality. It's a lonely job, so there's never any reason to make it lonelier than it is naturally.
Hi, I guess I wondered what you thought of the MFA route and if you recommend people get an MFA.
What I think of MFAs? Well, I have a very interesting relationship to that world and to this discourse that goes around it, because I never had one, And I didn't even get my BA. I was a sophomore on leave from Bennington College until I was 47, at which point Pratt put me out of my misery and gave me an honorary doctorate. But I don't know what it's like to get an MFA, except in that I have subsequently taught in some MFA programs. I'm not teaching in one now, I teach undergraduates. So it frees me in a way to be I think a hardy defender of that environment, that milieu, which gets slagged. There's kind of this generic attack on MFA, the idea of MFA fiction, or the MFA environment, that it's sort of this mill where people are just forcing everyone to write the same way and creating this kind of bland, competent mediocrity. And I think it's really ludicrous. I think it's this attack, which always comes from people who don't really have any idea what the inside of that experience is like, seems really resentful and you know, it's like it has the tone of a curdled resentment of something unknown, a kind of envy of the unknown. In my experience of them from teaching in them, MFA programs are really human places. I mean, there's nothing more human than a writing workshop. It's a bunch of people trying to do this incredibly esoteric, tender thing that none of them know how to do or can quantify even how you proceed. And that really includes the instructor. You know, that I write stories and novels, for me is a situation of fascination and continuing perplexity. I'm always still learning to do it. And so anyone who's in that situation of apprenticeship that I once went through, wherever they're enacting that, whether it's in a lonely room somewhere on an island, or whether it's in a group in an MFA program, is doing something quite tender and that should be treated, I think, as relatively sacred, even if the results are often, you know, appalling, embarrassing to everyone concerned, and they are often that, you know, because it's just such a, you know, it's like groups of beasts, groups of lions don't get around and workshop fiction. It's one of those things that actually proves that we're human beings, that we do this ridiculous thing, right? And the results that I see coming from students, the very small number who actually have that crazy luck to be both tenacious and somewhat talented and be very widely read, because I don't think anyone ever really succeeds in writing fiction who doesn't read the stuff, you know, compulsively. I actually think that's the primary place that writing fiction comes from, is reading fiction to absurd excess. But, so some people that you meet in the MFA program will have that, you know, hat trick. They'll be really dogged, they'll have some talent with language, and they'll be crazy readers. Well, even those ones write terrible stories at the beginning. Just terrible ones. And so encouraging them is the least you can do. You know? Now, as to the specific value of specific programs, some of which are very expensive and become treacherous for people because they go into massive debt to be there, navigating the world of whether it's a good idea for you with your specific life story, bank account, parents, to go to X expensive college for anything, let alone for an MFA, is a very specific decision. And I, you know, when people ask me that question, I try to help them with the question. But that's really different from saying, oh, MFAs are all great or MFAs are all terrible. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, isn't there's some risk? I mean, I agree with most of what you're saying, but I'm curious about this. I mean, when you're in a creative writing program, and I didn't go to one, but I'm just so curious, maybe you'll be able to explain this. When you're workshopping fish stories, people feel a responsibility to sort of have some kind of response.
Oh, yeah.
And won't their response tend to be addressing whatever sort of makes the work unique in and of itself? And that is the fear, like you say, there's this umbrella criticism of MFAs. And I think it's that all like the really weird things get whittled away because people have to say something when asked, respond to this story. And how do you avoid that as a teacher?
I think that it's self-correcting in a sense. I mean, yeah, of course that happens, but it should also be said that will be happening if you're showing your work to editors who don't understand the work, or to your family who doesn't
Yeah.
quite understand the work, or to your friends who don't. It'll happen all the time. People who have the iconoclastic vision will never be dissuaded from exercising it. And anyway, the marvelous thing about this strange practice of workshopping fiction is that contradictions emerge, as well as, there's a normative impulse. 4 or 5 people may say, you've got to take out all those weird whatevers they are. But some other people will be like, are you crazy? That's the best thing in the story. It's the only thing in the story. And these contradictions become the space in which the talent can develop itself. I think we're being told that we're done. I just thought this. Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, thank
Chuck,
you.
Thank you, Chuck, so much. Thanks. Thanks for coming.